In Perek Yud of Igeres HaTshuva, in yesterday's Shir of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe said that a person has to have both Tshuva Ilah and Tshuva Tator, the lower level Tshuva and the higher level Tshuva. The lower level Tshuva should be before the davening, as the Mishnah says that a person should come to the davening with a heaviness of heart and a humility, which is Tshuva Tator. And also, the davening should be B'simcha, because it says that a person should daven B'simcha in the Braisa. And since we can't switch from one emotion to another, the Alter Rebbe suggests that we have the Tshuva Tator at Tikkun Chatzeis, at the midnight prayer, and then the davening should be B'simcha. And in that way we have both the Tshuva Tator and the Tshuva Ilah. In Perek Yud Aleph, in the 11th chapter, today's Shir, the Rebbe is going to go on to say, Alter Rebbe will go on to say that a person has to have both virtues, the virtue of the humility and the virtue of Simcha. So to say that he should have the humility at night and the joy in the morning by the davening, so he's losing out on both ends. During the night he doesn't have the joy, and during the morning he doesn't have the humility. So the Alter Rebbe says that there is also a way in which a person can have both feelings at the same time. So we'll learn a little bit into Perek Yud Aleph, and then see how the Rebbe Shlita explains this whole thing. Perek Yud Aleph of the Igeres HaTshuva, page 198. The number at the bottom of the page is 380. Perek Yud Aleph. V'omnom lihiyes b'libei ha'achno. In order for the heart to feel the humility, Hi bechinas Tshuva Tator kenal, which is the level of Tshuva Tator, the lower level Tshuva, the Gam HaSimcha b'Hashem, and also the joy in God, which is the Tshuva Ilah, Shteihen b'yachad, in order to feel them both at the same time, not at different times. Kvar milsa amura b'lekutei amorim. Seif Perek Lamed Daled, I've already said in the first part of Tanya, in chapter 34, that it's possible to have both joy and sadness in the heart at the same time. As it says in the Zehar, that Belazar said to his father, who taught him the Kabbalistic meaning of the Churban, of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So Belazar said, when he had learned all this, he said, Chedvat kiya b'liboy misitra do, I have joy in my heart from the fact that I've studied Kabbalah and I've understood the hidden meanings of the Churban. And at the same time, there is sadness in my heart from the other side, from the realization of the extent of the damage and of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, which he never realized the extent of it before. So he had both joy and sadness in the heart at the same time. So there in Perek Lamed Daled, in the first part of Tanya, the explanation is that the person can feel two different feelings if they're coming from two different causes. If the sadness is because of one consideration, the joy because of a separate and different consideration, so that when both considerations exist, they both produce the appropriate emotion, so that he has both sadness and gladness in the heart at the same time. In addition to which, there is also the emunah, the faith and the trust, that his heart is perfectly confident in God, that God chooses kindness, and therefore he is compassionate and forgiving, and when one asks for forgiveness, the forgiveness is given. So take immediately when one asks for forgiveness from God, the forgiveness is given as we ask, erase my sin, kapseini tahareni, cleanse me, purify me, and all my sins erase. So when we ask for forgiveness, and it's 3 times, so there's no doubt, not even a shadow of a doubt, that God forgives. And the proof of it is to be found in the Shemona Esrei, in the Amidah. That take if kishem mevakshim, slach lanu immediately after asking for forgiveness. Slach lanu, we end the bracha by saying, Baruch Ato Hashem, Chanun Hamar B'Lisleach. Blessed are you, God, who is compassionate and forgives, which means that we receive the forgiveness. Now we know that if there's a doubt whether you should make a bracha or not, whether you've made the bracha already or whether you're obligated to make the bracha. So we take the lenient option, and that is not to make the bracha again. Mishum chash bracha levatolo, and we can't make the bracha even when there's a doubt. We can't make it in order to be extra frum and extra careful. We're not allowed to make the bracha because it's possible that it's a bracha levatolo, that it's a needless bracha. So how can we make the bracha here that God forgives us? How do we know for sure that He forgives us? And if we don't know for sure, then we're not allowed to make the bracha. So we see from this that Torah is telling us, Ella ein kan shum safek klal. There is no doubt here at all. Because we asked for forgiveness, there is no doubt that the forgiveness is given. The other brachas, where we ask that God should heal us and God should bless us and so on, and then we say that God heals and God blesses, how can we make that bracha? How can we be so sure that God will heal and bless? We see that it doesn't always happen. So there the explanation is that it happens in the spiritual. There's a spiritual blessing, a spiritual healing. And here, when we ask for forgiveness, of course the forgiveness is spiritual. So here the question is, how do we know that in the spiritual it is given? Now, there are a number of questions and contradictions that the Rebbe Shlita points out on this whole subject of the sadness and the joy, the lower level tshuva, higher level tshuva. For example, here in Perek Yud, yesterday's Shir, in Perek Yud of Egeres HaTshuva, the Alter Rebbe says that since we are an orphan generation, and we're not capable of going from one emotion to another, therefore we have to separate the sadness from the joy and have the sadness at night during Tikkun Chatzos and the joy in the morning during the davening. Perek Yud Aleph, the Rebbe suddenly says, in order to have them both together at the same time, it can be done, as he says in the Zohar, that there can be sadness on one part of the heart and joy on the other side of the heart, because they're coming from two separate considerations. So which is it? Are we incapable of having two emotions, not only at the same time, but even immediately following each other? And that's why we have to separate them to the point of having one at night and one in the morning. Or are we capable of having both at the same time? Another thing is that here, when the Alter Rebbe says that we can have both feelings at the same time, the joy and the sadness, so he quotes the Zohar, the same as in Perek Lamed Daled, in the first part of Tanya, in the Sefer Shel Beinani. But he adds here that it's not only that you can have two feelings because they're coming from two different places, two different causes, but also there is the joy that comes from the knowledge and the confidence that God has forgiven and erased the sin. So why here do we need that additional consideration? Whereas in Perek Lamed Daled he didn't need that consideration. And so on, many questions that the Rebbe Shlita points out. And the answer is that in the first part of Tanya, which is called Sefer Shel Beinani, the subject is a Beinani. A Beinani, the Alter Rebbe describes in Perek Yud Beis as one who did not sin ever and will never sin and is not a Rasha even for a moment all his life. And although a person who has sinned is fully capable of being a Beinani, as he says in Perek Yud Daled, that every person, Kol Adam, Yachol li is Beinani b'chol eisa b'chol shah. So it's not a contradiction. When a person has sinned and has done tshuva, there are times when the avera, the sin that he committed, even though it's forgiven, but yet it leaves a certain taste or a certain after effect on the person, which makes him think of the sin or at least be attracted to it again, even though he won't do it again. And that's why his tshuva is complete, because he'll never do the sin again. But the blemish is not removed, because the effect of a sin is that it leads to another sin. And that leading to the other sin, not that he will do another sin, but the temptation to do it again, or the temptation to do a sin is still there as a result of the first sin. And that's why it says that about tshuva has to be more careful and say about himself that he can't do the sin. That I'm incapable of sinning because he has to remove himself further and further from the sin because he still has a tendency towards the sin. So that's if the tshuva has been complete in that he is forgiven, but not in erasing or removing the blemish. Once the person does a tshuva that removes the blemish as well, and then he becomes a Beinani, because a Beinani is someone who won't even think of doing the sin again. Not only that he in fact doesn't do it, but he isn't even tempted to do it, to do the sin. That shows that the previous sin has been completely removed, and this effect that a sin has, that it draws and brings another sin, no longer exists. So it is true to say of this person that he has never sinned, because the sin of the past is completely gone. Not only forgiven, but gone. So this is the difference between the first part of Tanya and Igeres HaTshuva, that in the first part of Tanya he's talking about a person who no longer has any sin on his conscience. And therefore you can say of him that he has never sinned. The way he is now, he has never sinned. And he never will sin, because he doesn't even feel an attraction to the sin. He knows the pleasure of the sin, but he has no attraction to doing the sin. But in the Igeres HaTshuva, where he's not talking about a Beinani, he's talking about somebody who has sinned and is now in the process of doing tshuva. So between the Beinani and the person in the process of doing tshuva, there are many differences. And therefore, when he says in the first part of Tanya that a person can have both joy and sadness at the same time, he can be sad over the fact that his animal soul is unholy, while at the same time he is glad for the freedom that he has given his godly soul through Torah and mitzvahs. So that is an obvious and easily understood thing, because the animal soul in the Beinani and the godly soul are in two separate worlds. The animal soul never affects the godly soul, because it never takes control of the body, it never drags the godly soul down into sin. But here in Igeres HaTshuva, we're talking about a person who is considering the damage that he created, that he caused through his sin, and that is the dragging the Shekhinah into Golus. So obviously his godly soul has been affected by his animal soul. His godly soul is in exile within the animal soul. So it's not so easy, and it's not so clear to be able to separate the two and say, I'm glad because of my godly soul, I'm sad because of my animal soul. The godly and the animal have become entangled. And so here the Alter Rebbe says, for the Baal Tshuva, who is in the process of Tshuva, to say that even while he's feeling the sadness, he will also feel some joy. If he's feeling gladness, joy, while he's still doing the Tshuva, then his Tshuva will not be complete. He has to separate them. He has to feel a complete regret, a complete Tshuva, a complete sadness, and only after the sadness is complete can he then go on and feel the joy. But to bring the two together would be a clash, would be a contradiction. One would detract from the other. The little bit of joy that he feels would take away from the completeness of the sadness that he should feel and needs to feel over the sin. And that's why the Alter Rebbe says here that in order for him to feel joy, he has to experience it separate from the sadness. Then, in Perek Yud Aleph, the Rebbe says that on a higher level, a person can experience both at the same time. What does it mean on a higher level? The Rebbe is saying that a person has to experience both the lower level tshuva as well as the higher level tshuva. That it's not just two different people. Some people do a lower level tshuva, some people do a higher level tshuva. But that every person has to have both levels. Only there are two ways of going about that. There is the person who his primary Aveda is the lower level tshuva. Only in order to be complete, he has a taste of the higher level tshuva as well, on occasion. There's another level where his main tshuva is tshuva ilah, the higher level tshuva. But it has to be accompanied by the tshuva tato in order to make it complete and to round it out. So in Perek Yud, the Alter Rebbe is talking about a person whose main Aveda is tshuva tato. and therefore he has to reserve the joy for a time when the tshuva has already been accomplished. Because if he mixes the joy with the tshuva, as we said before, then the tshuva won't be complete. The lower level tshuva. In Perek Yud Aleph, the Alter Rebbe says that concerning a person whose main aveda is tshuva ilah, if his main aveda is tshuva ilah, he can have both at the same time. As we'll explain in a moment. The Rebbe Shlita points out that Yud and Yud Aleph, chapter Yud Aleph, also have a hint, contain a hint at these two levels, because Yud is the number of Svidus and the number of powers that the neshama has, which means that it's within the bounds of creation, whereas 11 represents that which is above creation. So in Perek Yud, the Alter Rebbe talks about a person whose main aved is Shuvah Tata. He's working with the talents that he has. Whereas in Perek Yud Aleph, he's talking about somebody who has risen above those limitations and is on the level of Shuvah Ilah. Only he has Shuvah Tata in order to complete it. Why is it that in Shuvah Ilah he can have both at the same time? That's because on the higher level of tshuva, he can have the sadness, the tshuva tata, that is connected with sins, that came from the animal soul overwhelming the godly soul, together with the joy, because along with the two separate causes, there's also the consideration of the faith and the trust that he has in the forgiveness of the sin. Why does he have to have that consideration? Because without that consideration, there wouldn't be an increase in the joy. The fact that he once sinned, and now he's on the level of tshuva ilah, then the sadness that he feels over the sin doesn't detract from his joy at all. On the contrary, it adds to the joy. How does it add to the joy? Because knowing that he has sinned makes it easier for him to accept gladly and joyously the unpleasant things that happen to him. Because he understands why they're happening and he accepts them willingly. So that increases the joy. And this can't happen by the Beinani in the first part of Tanya, where the Rebbe says that he can feel both sadness and joy at the same time, but he doesn't say that he considers the fact that he's forgiven. And that's because the feeling of sadness over the animal soul's condition has nothing to do with the joy of the godly soul. They're two separate things. Whereas in the Baal Tshuva, as we said earlier, the godly soul and the animal soul are mixed together. They're intertwined. So that the sadness of the animal soul directly affects the godly soul, both in the negative when he was sinning, and now when he's doing tshuva, it affects the godly soul in the positive, that it intensifies the joy. So that's only by the Baal Tshuva, not by the Beinani. And it's only when you're doing tshuva on the higher level, tshuva ilah, that we're told that the sin actually becomes a mitzvah. Not only that it's canceled out, but it becomes a mitzvah. And therefore, in the higher level of tshuva, the person can have the sadness and the joy at the same time because they complement each other. The sadness over the sin is also a reason for joy because the sin has become an actual mitzvah, not only erased and forgiven. Now we'll go back to the Tanya. On Daf Kuf Amud Aleph, page 382. The Alter Rebbe shows how by making the bracha, thanking God for forgiving us, we see that the forgiveness is guaranteed, and therefore this confidence in the forgiveness that God gives adds to the joy of the Baal Tshuva. Now the question is concerning the Geula. We make a bracha. Just as we make a bracha over the forgiveness, we also make a bracha that God redeems us, takes us out of Golus, and yet we see that we're not taken out of Golus. So the Alter Rebbe says, and if after making these brachas we would not once again do a sin, we would be immediately taken out of Golus. we make the bracha thanking God for redeeming us. Yet we see that we're not redeemed, so the answer is because we went back to sinning. So here also the Rebbe Shvita points out, a person doesn't go back to sinning immediately while davening, in the middle of the davening. So after he makes the bracha, thanking God for taking us out of Golus, he continues his davening, so he doesn't sin, there's no opportunity even for sin, and yet we're not taken out of Golus. So the Rebbe explains that when the Alter Rebbe says that we would be taken out of Golus immediately, it doesn't mean that we would be in Eretz Yisrael immediately. It means that making that bracha guarantees that the process of Geula begins. Eliyahu Hanavi comes, and 3 days in advance, and he tells us about Mashiach coming, and all those things that the Rambam mentions about Mashiach begin to happen, and so on. And they would happen were it not for the fact that in between, in other words, the Geula begins every time we make the bracha, and then after davening we go back to sinning, and we stop the process, and Mashiach doesn't actually come. Now this level of forgiveness, that immediately upon asking we are forgiven, seems to be a little bit difficult to understand. Why should we be forgiven so easily? So the Alter Rebbe says, the fact is that I feel that even a human being is supposed to be this way. A person is supposed to forgive immediately when asked for forgiveness. And one should not be cruel by holding back or refusing forgiveness. And we see in the Gemara that even if one cuts off another person's hand, which means that it is a permanent damage, yet, we see there in the Gemara that if one refuses to forgive for such a damage, for such a wound, that when asked for forgiveness, that refusal to forgive is considered cruel. And if a person asks you for forgiveness for 3 times and you don't forgive, he doesn't have any obligation to ask him again. So we see from this that no matter what the damage was, no matter what the sin was, a person never has to ask for forgiveness more than 3 times. And so to any hurt and to any damage, one is supposed to be forgiving upon request. So if a person asks 3 times, which makes it a chazakah, means that he's sincere, but as soon as you know that he's sincere, you have to forgive, regardless of the degree of damage or the degree of hurt. So that's concerning the human being, that a human being has to forgive when asked to forgive. So certainly God is that way, that when we ask for forgiveness, He gives forgiveness. How far should this compassion go? How compassionate is one supposed to be is God. And how compassionate is God? So we find that David came to the Givenim, the nation called Givein, and he asked them to forgive Shaul, who had killed members of the Givenim, and they refused to forgive Gozar David Aleim. So David decreed that they should not be accepted as converts, they should not become members of the people of God, who are by nature compassionate and forgiving. So we see that even though Shaul actually killed members of Gibeon, not only hurt them, but killed them, and Shaul himself wasn't even asking for forgiveness. It was David asking them to forgive Shaul. And yet, when they refused to forgive, that showed a cruelty in their character, and therefore the appropriate punishment was that they should not be accepted as a member of the people who by nature are compassionate and forgiving. And as the Alter Rebbe says elsewhere, that punishment is not merely retribution. Punishment for every sin is the outgrowth of the sin itself. Not having a certain capacity for compassion, they therefore do not belong and don't fit in the Jewish people who have a great capacity for compassion. And therefore, if that's true of a human being, that's how compassionate we're supposed to be, and this is how forgiving we're supposed to be, so certainly with God it is infinitely more so that He is more compassionate and more forgiving. In the Hayom Yom, for the 28th of Tammuz, which is also Shabbos Mevorchim of, the Rebbe writes that each of the Rabbeim had a mimer, certain mimer, that they would use to purify and cleanse the world, the atmosphere of the world, the air. And they would say it once in 2 or 3 years. They would repeat the mimer, and they would say it in public. One of the maimarim of the Alter Rebbe was the mimer Hecholzu, which is in Lekutei Torah, without the Hagoros. The Mittler Rebbe's mimer was the mimer Yofa Sha'achas, whose content were the first 10 chapters, the first 10 paragraphs of the Maimer Hine Kol Echad V'Echad Eimer Elokai Neshama, which is in Derech HaChaim. One of the Tzemach Tzedek's Maimerim was the Maimer Ma Teivu, which is in Lekutei Torah, and one of the Rebbe Marash's Maimerim, my grandfather's Maimer, was Mika Meicha Be'elin, and one of my father's Maimerim, the Rebbe Rashab's Maimerim, was the Maimer V'Yadaita Hayei Moskva, that was said in the year Reish Nun Zayin.